In example 2, we're given the equation and we need to write, we're given the graph and we need to write the equation. So we're going to still think about how something was graphed using DAB-C, and then we can translate that back into the equation. So if you're looking at your graph, can you find your center line? How do I know my center line is at y equals 1? And then I'll know that my d value is 1. Well, sometimes you can eyeball it, right? Sometimes you can just sort of say, it looks like 1 is in the middle. If I check it, how far is it to my maximum? I go up 5. How far is it to my minimum? I go down 5. Perfect. It's right in the middle. So sometimes you can eyeball it. But the sinusoidal axis, I said sometimes it's called a center line. Sometimes it's called the average. Because what it really is it's right in between your maximum and your minimum. Does it make sense that your center line's right in the middle? And if you're finding something right in between two values, that's an average. So if my maximum is 6 and my minimum is -4, how do you find an average? You got 6 out of 10 on one test, next test you got -4 out of 10. Bad example. How do you find an average? You would divide them by 2. Add them up and divide by 2. You get 1. There's your center line that way as well. So there's our d value. Well, what did our a value do? When we graphed, we used our amplitude to find our maximum and our minimum. So now I've got my center line at 1. If my maximum is at 6, how much did I go up? I went up 5, so my amplitude needs to be 5. Our b value. Well, we always figured out our period from our b value. And we had a formula that said period is 2 pi over our b value. And then underneath that formula, I also said we can rearrange this. We can rearrange this and say that our b value is 2 pi divided by our period. And this is going to be helpful in this situation. Now to figure out our period, I like to use, in this case I'm going to use from one minimum to another minimum. That would be one full period. Can you see that if I count spaces, I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spaces are between one minimum and the other minimum. How much is one space? Can you see that one space on this is pi over 12? So on this graph, my period eight spaces would be 8 pi over 12. And my b value is going to be 2 pi divided by my period. Dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. If you simplify that, 24 pi over 8 pi, pi's will cancel, 24 over 8, your b value is 3. And finally, to get your c value, you have to think, where does a graph normally start? In this case, it says in terms of sine. So we have to think about our sine graph. A sine graph starts in the middle going up. When does that happen on my graph? In the middle going up happens right here. If that's in the middle going up, I've moved 3 spaces to the right. If I've moved 3 spaces to the right and each space is pi over 12, that would be 3 pi over 12 to the right. I can now take all of that information and write my equation. Y equals, my amplitude is 5. Sine, my b value is 3, bracket. How do I show 3 pi over 12 or pi over 4 to the right? It would be x minus pi over 4, and my center line plus 1. And so we use the DAB-C backwards to find all of our values, using the special components of amplitude and period and sinusoidal axes, and knowing where does a sine graph start? In the middle going up. Notice that this question, when they asked the question, they said determine an equation, not the equation, because there's more than one right answer. Can you see here we have another point on the center line going up. So it could have been shifted 11 pi over 12 to the right. And if you had written that, full answers, full marks. It's not, there's more than one right answer. I mean, if this graph keeps on going, right, you could have found another one over here where it's shifted. You want to make my life miserable, you find one way far down and hope you've done the math right, because I have to check it. But then you also have to hope I don't make a mistake in checking your math. So it's probably safer just to go, most people just go with the closest one they can find. But there is more than one right answer. And this question said in terms of sine. Can you see we could have done this same question and done in terms of cos? Just for fun, does the amplitude change if I think about a cos graph? No. Does the period change if it's a cos graph? No. Is the sinusoidal axis any different if I'm thinking about a cos graph? No. The only thing that's different is where does a cos graph start? A cos graph starts at a maximum. Where is that maximum? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces to the right. Each of those spaces is pi over 12. There's the same equation in terms of cos. If you take out your graphing calculator and you graph this equation, and then you graph this equation in a different color if you have the colored version, or a different thickness of line if you have the regular one, you'll notice those two graphs are identical. Just one's in terms of sine and one is in terms of cos. All right, questions for practice for this one are 4, 5, 6, and 7.